close your eyes. The ocean remembers everything. Its waves carry the whispers of those who once believed they could master it. Men of steel, ambition, and fragile hope. Among those whispers, one story still drifts beneath the Atlantic moonlight. It begins not with a scream, but with a hum. The hum of engines, the promise of triumph. A floating palace, they called her. Unsinkable, they said, but the sea does not bargain. It only listens, then waits. Tonight we journey through time, to the night when light met darkness, when pride met humility, and when one man, Thomas Andrews, stood at the edge of creation and watched his masterpiece learn to die. So breathe deeply, let the past unfold like mist over still water, and drift with me. The ocean was still that morning, too still, perhaps, for something so alive. In the harbor of Southampton, April sunlight spilled across the steel ribs of a ship so vast that even the gulls seemed hesitant to circle it. Workers stood silent for a moment, staring up at what they had built. It wasn't just iron and rivets anymore. It was pride made visible. It was a dream that floated. Among the figures on the dock stood Thomas Andrews, the architect, the man who had drawn the blueprints that became a legend before she even touched the sea. His coat flapped gently in the cold wind, his eyes following the slow movement of the ship as tugboats began to pull her away from the pier. Around him, cheers rose. Hats flew into the air. Bands played triumphant brass. But he didn't cheer. He simply watched. To him, the ship was more than a triumph of engineering. It was a living thing, a creature of steel and fire. He could almost hear her heartbeat through the vibrations of her engines, steady and proud. The world called her unsinkable, but Andrews flinched every time he heard the word. He knew the arrogance it carried. Ships were not made to defy the ocean, only to ask its mercy. As the RMS Titanic slipped away from the dock, her wake rippled through the water, soft and perfect like the brushstroke of an artist who doesn't yet know his painting will one day burn. The passengers waved to the crowds below, faces full of excitement, unaware that every goodbye would soon become a ghost story. Andrews stood alone at the railing, gloved hands resting on the cold metal. The sea stretched endlessly ahead, blue, silent, eternal. Behind him, men shouted orders, ropes creaked, and steam hissed into the sky. Around him, the smell of salt and iron blended with faint perfume drifting from the decks above. The ship was alive now, her lungs filled, her heart beating beneath the waves. He felt something stir in his chest, not pride, but unease. He had built this colossus with precision beyond reason, with the faith that mathematics could master chaos. But as the ship gained speed, he realized something quietly unsettling. Perfection is a fragile illusion, and the sea is patient enough to break it. He whispered under his breath, "Safe voyage, my girl, may the ocean be kind." The words were lost to the wind. Below deck, stokers shoveled coal into the roaring furnaces. Sparks flew, painting their faces in gold and shadow. Every shovel stroke drove the ship faster, stronger, prouder, and further into destiny. Above, passengers laughed and leaned against the rails, feeling the hum of the engines beneath their feet. No one noticed the architect still standing there, still staring into the horizon like a man who already knew the ending of his own story. And if you had been there, beside him, if you had looked into his eyes at that exact moment, you might have asked, did he sense it? Did he know the ocean would take back what man had claimed? Or did he simply love too deeply what he had created to ever imagine its fall? The ship's horn sounded, long, deep, almost mournful, and with that, the floating dream began her voyage into eternity. Long before the sea carried her weight, the ship existed only as a sound, the hammering of 15,000 men echoing through the gray skies of Belfast. It was not music, not yet, but to Thomas Andrews, it was a kind of hymn, the song of creation. Each morning, the shipyard came alive with motion. Steam hissed from pipes. Sparks rained from the rivets. The clang of iron against iron rose like prayer. If you stood among those men, hands blistered, faces blackened by soot. You would feel the rhythm beneath your ribs, the slow, steady heartbeat of something vast being born. Andrews walked those yards every day, notebook in hand, eyes bright with a quiet fire. He greeted the workers by name, paused to examine the angle of a beam or the line of a bulkhead. He was not the kind of man who shouted orders. His authority was quiet, almost tender. The men respected him for that. A gentleman who listens to steel, they used to say. He believed that a ship carried not only cargo, but memory, that every hammer blow left a trace of its maker's soul. When he touched the hull, still rough and cold, he could feel their lives vibrating through the metal, the laughter in the break room, the whispered songs about home, the curses muttered into the wind. He thought, if steel could speak, what would it tell me? Day by day, the skeleton grew taller. The ribs of the hull curved upward toward the sky, like a cathedral of iron. Andrews would sometimes step back and imagine the ship not as a machine, but as a promise that human hands could rival the gods of the deep. It was a dangerous kind of faith, but he could not help believing in it. What else was progress, if not defiance dressed in elegance? At night, when the hammers fell silent, the yard became eerily still. Andrews would walk between the half-built walls, hearing the faint echoes of the day, a child's laughter from a worker's home nearby, the cry of gulls, the slow, dying hum of cooling metal. In those moments, he felt both creator and captive. To build something greater than yourself was to surrender a part of yourself to it. He remembered the night Lord Peary and Bruce Ismay first spoke of the idea, not just a ship, but a floating empire. Speed doesn't matter, Ismay had said, swirling his brandy. We will crush them with luxury. Andrews had smiled politely, but inwardly he thought, luxury is only a mask. Beneath it, everything rusts. Still, he built it, not for wealth, nor for glory, but because he could not imagine doing anything else. Some men built homes, others monuments. He built dreams, vast, fragile dreams that floated. He knew every inch of her, from the grand staircase crowned with glass, to the lowest rivet below the waterline. And he loved her, perhaps too much. When the final plate was bolted into place, the workers cheered. Steam roared, flags waved. Champagne broke against the hull. But Andrews did not celebrate. He stood apart, hand resting on the cold steel. He whispered a small prayer, not to God, but to the ship itself. You will outlive us all, he said softly. The ship creaked, as if answering back. And if you listen closely, if you close your eyes right now, you might still hear it. The clang of hammers fading into memory, the ghosts of laborers singing through the iron, the heartbeat of ambition pounding beneath layers of time. And ask yourself, when does creation end and obsession begin? When does pride become prayer? And when we build something to touch eternity, do we also build the seeds of our own ruin? The echo of those hammers never stopped. It only changed its rhythm, from the music of birth to the slow, mournful drumming beneath the sea. London, 1907. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a restless ghost, and the city beyond it shimmered faintly in the gaslight. Inside the mahogany-paneled study of Lord Peary, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of ambition. 3 men sat around a gleaming table, and between them, without a word spoken, floated the shape of a dream too large for its own good. Bruce Ismay was the first to break the silence. His voice was confident, too confident, like someone who'd mistaken pride for destiny. The Germans are ahead of us, he said, exhaling a ribbon of smoke. Faster ships, grander salons. They believe they own the Atlantic. We'll prove them wrong. We'll build something so magnificent that speed will no longer matter. People will cross the ocean just to be seen aboard it. Lord Peary chuckled, swirling his glass of brandy. His eyes gleamed the way an engineer's eyes do when he imagines metal bending to his will. A ship so vast, he murmured, that the sea itself must step aside. Thomas Andrews listened quietly, his fingers tracing the edge of a blueprint rolled out before them. He was younger then, not yet haunted by ghosts or rivets. His thoughts were pure geometry, the elegant curve of a hull, the balance of beauty and strength. Yet even in that moment, a small unease stirred beneath the surface of his mind. "You would make her larger than the Olympic?" he asked softly. Ismay smiled. "Larger, finer, safer. Unsinkable." The word hung in the air, absurd and holy at once. Andrew's pencil froze above the paper. Unsinkable. A word no sailor should ever speak aloud. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing gold light across their faces. On the wall hung paintings of old ships battling storm and cannon fire, reminders of a time when the ocean was still feared, not challenged. But the men in this room no longer feared it. They wanted to tame it, to make it serve tea and dance under chandeliers. "Think of it," Ismay said, his voice growing fervent. "A city afloat, marble baths, electric elevators, dining rooms as grand as palaces. A ship so perfect, she'll make every other vessel obsolete." Peary raised his glass. "To progress," he toasted. Andrews hesitated before clinking his own. "To humility," he murmured. But no one heard him. Outside, the fog thickened. The Thames moved quietly under the moonlight, dark and slow, as if the river itself were listening. Perhaps it already knew. Rivers always lead to oceans, and oceans always take what is owed. For hours, they spoke of tonnage and turbines, of gold-trimmed cabins and ballroom floors. Yet beneath their words, there was another conversation, one the sea would someday answer. Andrews lingered after the others left, alone with the drawings and the silence. He studied the lines of the proposed ship, the sweep of her hull, the symmetry of her decks, and felt something strange. Awe, yes, but also dread, because he knew what all builders secretly know, that every masterpiece carries within it the seed of its own undoing. He pressed his palm flat against the blueprint, as though feeling the pulse of something not yet alive. In that quiet, the sound of rain against the glass seemed to echo like distant waves. If you listen now, if you let your mind drift through time, you can almost hear it too. The murmur of those gentlemen's boasts turning into ghosts. The crackle of the fire blending with the hush of an unseen tide. And maybe you'll ask yourself, softly, when does vision become vanity? How many dreams must drown before we learn to fear our own genius? Andrews turned down the lamp, rolled the plans carefully, and stepped into the fog outside. London's gaslights shimmered like stars trapped beneath glass. He looked once toward the dark river and whispered, "Let's hope the sea forgives us." The fog swallowed his voice. The dream, however, did not forget. By the time the hull of Titanic was nearly complete, the shipyard had become its own living world. The clatter of hammers no longer startled anyone. It was the heartbeat of the city. Every man who walked through those iron gates felt it in his bones, that pulse, steady and certain, as though the ship herself were breathing beneath their feet. Thomas Andrews moved through that world like a quiet spirit. He was not merely a supervisor. He was a listener. He ran his hand along the curved bulkheads, the newly polished brass, the endless corridors that gleamed like arteries. He could almost feel warmth radiating from the steel, faint but unmistakable. "She's alive," one of the men once joked, mopping sweat from his brow. Andrews didn't laugh. He simply nodded. The ship was no longer just a structure. It was memory solidified, the echo of 1,000 hammers turned into form. Every beam, every bolt, every rivet was a sentence in a language only builders could read, and he read it fluently. In the mornings, he walked through the first-class dining hall where sunlight poured through unfinished windows, scattering dust like stars. He paused, watching the beams of light shift across the tiled floor. One day, he thought, laughter would fill this room, music would shimmer through the air, and fine silver would clink against crystal. For now, there was only silence and the faint rhythm of construction beyond the walls. In the lower decks, he descended among the laborers. Men stripped to their undershirts, faces black with coal dust, their songs rough and brave. They worked in the glow of lanterns, shadows long and alive. Some had lost fingers. Some had lost hope. But when Andrews passed, they straightened a little, as though his presence reminded them they were building something sacred. He treated them as equals, and that alone made him different. He believed every man who touched the ship left a trace of himself within it. The riveter's laughter, the painter's quiet whistle, the engineer's tired sigh. All these sounds were swallowed by the steel. And maybe, just maybe, the ship listened. Sometimes, late at night, Andrews would remain behind after the yard had emptied. He would walk alone through the echoing corridors, past unfinished staircases and half-built cabins, listening to the faint creak of the hull settling. It was like hearing a newborn draw its first breath. He'd whisper softly, "You'll see the world soon," and his voice would vanish into the stillness. Was it madness to speak to a ship, or faith, the kind of faith that builders once had when raising cathedrals? Because that's what she was, not just a vessel, but a cathedral to human ambition, built not for God but for progress, a floating monument to the belief that mankind could polish chaos into beauty. And yet, in the hum of the engines and the glow of the brass, he sometimes sensed something else, a faint tremor, a warning. The steel beneath his hand felt warm, but restless, like it knew the ocean was waiting. He stood one evening before the great propellers, half submerged, glistening like silver moons. Their sheer size dwarfed everything, a reminder that power, unchecked, always leans toward destruction. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the light caught his face, part dreamer, part mourner. He thought of his wife back in Belfast, her letters tucked neatly into his pocket. She had once written, "Do you ever feel the ship looks back at you?" And now he did. If you had walked past him then, through the twilight of the shipyard, you might have seen a man touching the hull as though listening for a heartbeat. And you might have wondered, as he did, when does metal become alive? When does pride begin to pray? And if steel truly holds a soul, can it also hold a curse? In the distance, the siren of another vessel wailed across the harbor. The sound rolled through the fog, like a warning disguised as wind. But Andrews only smiled faintly, hands still pressed against the cold curve of his creation. "She's ready," he whispered. The sea, somewhere beyond the docks, whispered back. April 10th, 1912. Southampton glimmered beneath a pale spring sun, its harbor alive with motion, gulls wheeling overhead, crowds pressing close to the docks, and a distant brass band struggling to rise above the noise of steam and shouts. The Titanic loomed over it all, her hull black and gold against the light, a mountain of iron that seemed almost to hold its own weather. From the pier, she looked eternal, too vast, too beautiful to belong to men. Children on their fathers' shoulders pointed in awe. Vendors sold postcards with her name printed in proud block letters. Even the air seemed charged, humming with the electricity of something about to be remembered forever. Thomas Andrews stood slightly apart from the commotion, his bowler hat held in his hands. He had been here before, at the launches of other ships, lesser sisters to this one, but never had he felt this kind of silence inside himself. Around him, laughter and cheers filled the air, yet it all reached him as if from underwater, muffled and distant. He watched the crew move with practiced precision, ropes coiling, steam rising, banners waving. On the decks above, passengers leaned over the rails, faces glowing with excitement. The wealthy, the hopeful, the lost, all bound together by the same illusion, safety. Andrews looked up at them, and for a moment, it struck him how much faith humanity could pour into metal and rivets. They believed in this ship the way ancient men believed in their gods. The whistle blew, a long, resonant moan that made the air tremble. The sound rolled over the city, deep and mournful, as though the ship herself were exhaling for the first time. People cheered, flags waved, and slowly, almost reluctantly, the Titanic began to move. Her massive hull slid away from the pier, cutting through the gray water like a blade of light. The tug strained against her bulk, pulling her into the open channel. The crowd roared, hats lifted, handkerchiefs fluttered like white birds in farewell. Andrew stood still, watching the gap widen. He had built her to endure, but in this moment, watching her drift away from land, he understood something he had never admitted even to himself. He had not built her to live. He had built her to be beautiful. The sunlight caught on her windows, scattering reflections across the water. For a brief instant, it looked as though the sea itself was applauding her departure. Andrew smiled faintly. She was everything he had dreamed of: strong, elegant, perfect in proportion. But as he turned toward the horizon, where the Atlantic stretched endless and pale, he felt that same quiet unease return, the one that had followed him since Belfast. It whispered, barely audible, "Perfection is never safe." He boarded last, walking the gangway alone as the ropes were untied. The wooden planks creaked beneath his steps, the sound of leaving something behind. Once aboard, he paused and looked back at the harbor. The crowd was shrinking now, swallowed by distance, their voices lost beneath the low hum of engines. He exhaled, long and slow. This was the moment every creator must face, the release. When the thing you've built begins to belong to the world, not to you. He leaned against the railing, feeling the hum of the ship vibrate beneath his fingertips. It was steady, alive, a heart that beat because he had willed it to. Behind him, an officer called out orders. Ahead, the horizon opened like an unturned page. If you'd been standing there beside him, you might have heard him whisper, "Take care of them, my girl. They believe in you." The ship answered with another long whistle, lower this time, almost human. And as the dock vanished into haze and the sea took her fully, Andrews finally smiled. He didn't wave. He didn't look back, because he knew, once a ship leaves the shore, she never truly returns. Only her stories do. And you, listening now, might wonder, what does it feel like to create something too perfect to survive? Do we ever truly launch our dreams, or do we simply let them drift away, praying the tides will be kind? The wind rose, the sea shimmered, and the ship, radiant and unknowing, began her journey toward legend. By the second morning, the Titanic had already become a small floating world, self-contained, radiant, and unaware of its destiny. The sea stretched like glass in every direction, calm and endless, and above it the ship glided in near silence, her engines so smooth that passengers swore they couldn't feel her move. It was as if the ocean itself had paused in awe. Thomas Andrews stood on the boat deck as sunlight spilled across the railings, glinting off polished brass and varnished wood. Crewmen in crisp uniforms carried luggage. Stewards hurried past with trays of tea and scones, and on every deck laughter rippled like soft wind. He had seen other ships begin their voyages, but never one that breathed such confidence. It was not arrogance, exactly. More like a kind of dream that everyone agreed to believe in at once. From where he stood, Andrews could see it all. The glittering promenades of first class, where gentlemen in top hats escorted women draped in silks that shimmered like fish scales in sunlight. The humbler second-class deck, where school teachers and merchants leaned against the rails, sharing quiet hopes of the new world waiting across the sea. And far below, unseen by most, the crowded quarters of third class, families huddled together, singing softly in languages the Atlantic had never heard before. One ship, one sea, and 1,000 different worlds. He walked slowly, taking it all in. The laughter, the voices, the smell of salt and cigar smoke, the faint hum of the engines beneath his feet. He felt proud, yes, but pride had a taste to it, and this morning it was bittersweet. He paused by the glass dome above the grand staircase. Sunlight poured through it like holy water, scattering across the carved oak panels and gilded balustrades. Passengers moved through the space like actors on a stage built for eternity, unaware of the fragile thread holding it all together. A steward approached, smiling. "Morning, sir. She's running smooth as silk." Andrews nodded. "Aye, for now." The steward didn't notice the shadow that crossed his face as he walked away. Later that day, he descended to the lower decks, inspecting the machinery, the boiler rooms, the cabins. The air was hot and heavy with the smell of coal and oil. The stokers worked bare-chested in the glow of the furnaces, shoveling fire into the hungry mouths of the engines. Their sweat fell like rain, their rhythm perfectly timed. Human heartbeats, keeping the Colossus alive. Andrews nodded to them as he passed. He knew what it meant to give your body to something larger than yourself. When he returned topside, evening was falling. The sky blazed with orange and gold. The ship's white hull turned rose in the fading light. A quartet played near the first-class lounge, their melody drifting through the air like perfume. Couples danced. Glasses clinked. The ocean whispered against the hull. It all seemed eternal, as if the world had paused just to admire itself. Andrews stood at the rail, watching the sun sink below the horizon. Behind him, the laughter continued. Champagne and music, the sound of perfect ignorance. Ahead, the sea darkened, stretching toward night. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he could almost hear the ship herself breathing, steady, content, unaware. He thought of something his father once said. Dreams are the most dangerous kind of ship. They never know when they're sinking. When he opened his eyes, the first stars had appeared, tiny, trembling lights reflected in the black surface of the ocean. He whispered softly, "Beautiful, isn't it?" No one answered. If you had been there beside him, you might have felt what he did. That strange ache in the chest, when beauty becomes too perfect to last. And maybe you would have asked, when does a dream stop being a dream? When it comes true, or when it begins to end? The band played on. The ship glided forward, and the Atlantic, silent and patient, waited for its turn to speak. That evening, the ship glittered like a palace adrift among the stars. Every porthole, every chandelier, every brass lamp reflected light until it seemed the Titanic carried her own constellation across the Atlantic. The sea outside was black and calm, a mirror so perfect that sky and water became one. In the grand dining saloon, violins sang beneath the glow of crystal lamps. The air shimmered with perfume, laughter, and the faint click of silverware. Gentlemen in pressed tuxedos raised glasses of champagne, their cufflinks winking like tiny suns. Women in silk and lace glided through the hallways, their jewels scattering prisms of color. It was not a dinner. It was a performance, a celebration of human mastery over darkness, over fear, over nature itself. And above it all, beneath the great glass dome, Thomas Andrews stood quietly. He had joined the evening's festivities out of courtesy, but he could not bring himself to sit. Instead, he lingered at the balcony's edge, looking down upon the swirling color below. The glass dome caught the reflection of the chandeliers, multiplying them until it seemed as though 1,000 suns were trapped above their heads. It was breathtaking, and yet, in that endless reflection, something unsettled him. He thought of the deep water beneath the ship, cold and unknowable, and how this fragile sphere of glass stood between humanity and oblivion. A passenger approached, Mr. John Jacob Astor, his smile confident, his words smooth. "A marvel, isn't she, Mr. Andrews? I dare say the Egyptians would envy this kind of pyramid." Andrews smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but they built theirs to last forever. We only build ours to impress." Astor laughed, clapping him on the shoulder, and returned to the glittering crowd. Andrews remained. He watched his servants move like clockwork, as laughter rose in polished harmony, as the ship hummed beneath their feet. A low, endless note, like breath drawn in before a plunge. He noticed a crack in a mirror near the staircase, so small it might have been invisible to anyone else. He touched it lightly, and in the faint reflection, his face split in two. It wasn't much, a trick of light, perhaps, but something about it made him pause. He turned his eyes upward to the dome again. The sky above was clear, almost painfully so, the stars cold and bright. For a moment, he couldn't tell whether he was looking through glass at heaven, or down through water at the reflection of another world entirely. A steward passed by with a silver tray. "Would you like a drink, sir?" "No, thank you," Andrews replied softly. "I'm already drunk on the view." The steward smiled politely and walked on. He stood there long after the others had left, listening to the last notes of the orchestra fade into silence. The glass above him darkened as the night deepened. The reflections vanished one by one until only his own remained, small, alone, surrounded by shadow. And he wondered, not for the first time, can beauty be too perfect? Can light blind us to the truth waiting in the dark? And when we build our heavens upon the sea, do we ever ask what lies beneath? The engines thrummed softly, steady as a heartbeat. The ship swayed ever so slightly, her mass moving in rhythm with the unseen pulse of the ocean. Andrews rested his hand on the rail, feeling the vibration pass through his bones. He closed his eyes. The hum of the ship blended with the wind, the sea, and for a moment, it almost sounded like music, a lullaby for a dream too large to last. The night was softer than silk. The sea stretched endlessly beneath a pale moon, so still it seemed carved from glass. Above that vast, unbroken quiet, the Titanic floated like a lantern drifting through eternity. Her decks shimmered with starlight. Her smokestacks exhaled faint ribbons of white against the deep blue. Somewhere on the promenade, a violin began to play. The notes drifted into the night, light at first, like snowflakes falling on water, then deeper, warmer alive. It was not a song for dancing or celebration. It was a song for listening. Passengers leaned against the rails, whispering softly to one another. The sea was calm, the air gentle, the music perfect. Everything, they said, was perfect. But Thomas Andrews stood apart, just beyond the circle of light, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes on the horizon. The violinist, Wallace Hartley, nodded to him once, a silent greeting between craftsmen. Andrews nodded back. Two men of precision and feeling, one who built in sound, the other in steel, both aware that perfection can wound as easily as it can inspire. The melody changed, becoming slower, sadder. It seemed to gather the night itself into its rhythm. The hush of the waves, the murmur of distant engines, the soft clink of glasses on deck. Andrews closed his eyes, letting the sound move through him. It was beautiful, too beautiful. Then, beneath it, so faint it could almost be imagined, he heard something else. A low, steady sigh, rising from the deep. Not mechanical, not human. It was the kind of sound that has no direction, no source. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, like a voice the sea had been holding back until this moment. He turned his head slightly, listening harder. The music continued, graceful and pure, but the whisper remained, soft, rhythmic, ancient. It was not warning. Not yet. It was simply present. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of salt and coal. A wave touched the hull, subtle but deliberate, as though the ocean were tapping politely, reminding them, "I'm still here." Andrews leaned over the rail, looking down at the reflection of the ship, a perfect mirror image glowing on the still surface. For an instant, it looked as though there were two Titanics, one above, shining with light and laughter, one below, silent and waiting. He felt his heartbeat slow, matching the rhythm of that unseen twin. He straightened, brushing a hand through his hair, forcing a smile when a passenger greeted him. "Beautiful night, isn't it, Mr. Andrews?" "The most beautiful," he said softly, almost unreal. The man laughed, clapping him on the shoulder, and walked on. Andrews stayed by the rail, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky met the sea. The stars seemed unusually bright, sharp as nails, piercing through the darkness. He thought of his ship, flawless, enormous, alive, and wondered if the sea was admiring her too, or measuring her. If you had been standing beside him then, you might have heard it too, that faint murmur beneath the melody, that subtle shifting tone that did not belong to any instrument. And perhaps you would have asked yourself, does the sea warn us, or does it only watch? When something whispers from the deep, do we listen, or call it imagination? The final notes of the violin faded into silence. The passengers applauded softly, their laughter returning, the spell broken. But Andrews lingered long after the music had stopped, still listening to the waves, to the wind, to the whisper beneath it all. The night air cooled. The stars pulsed, and somewhere miles ahead, in the direction they were heading, the sea whispered again, patient, timeless, and terribly sure of what was to come. The third night came quietly, as if the ocean itself had decided to hold its breath. No wind, no waves, just stillness, vast and perfect. The Titanic cut through the black water like a blade through glass, her wake spreading outward and long, ghostly lines that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. Passengers called it peaceful, sailors called it eerie, and Thomas Andrews, walking alone along the deserted promenade, called it something else entirely, unnatural. The air was cold and clear, sharp enough to sting his lungs when he breathed in. The stars above were so bright they cast faint shadows across the deck, turning the ship into a floating cathedral of silver and silence. From somewhere deep within the hull came the steady thrum of engines, the heartbeat of a giant that never slept. Andrews moved slowly, hands clasped behind his back, coat collar turned up against the chill. The night watch saluted as he passed, and he nodded absently, lost in thought. Every sound carried in the cold air, the faint creak of metal, the whisper of a flag against its pole, the soft scrape of his shoes on the wooden planks. It was so quiet that even these small sounds seemed to echo. He stopped at the rail and looked out over the sea. The horizon had disappeared entirely. There was no line separating ocean from sky, only a vast, infinite darkness scattered with stars. It was as if the ship were suspended in space, drifting not through water, but through eternity itself. He remembered something Captain Smith had said earlier that day, as they reviewed the ship's speed and course. "Smoothest sea I've seen in 20 years, the old man had remarked. Not a ripple tonight. Andrews had smiled, but his mind had whispered a different truth. Calm seas often come before storms. Below deck, the passengers slept soundly, secure in their belief that progress had tamed nature. The first-class cabins glowed faintly through curtained windows, warm with the soft light of electric lamps. Laughter had faded hours ago, replaced by the rhythm of distant engines and the faint hiss of steam. Andrew stood motionless for a long time, staring into the dark. He felt something, not fear, exactly, but awareness. A pressure beneath the calm. A sense that the sea was not sleeping, merely waiting. A faint sound broke the stillness, a distant crack, far below. He turned sharply, listening. Then another, softer, almost like the sound of ice shifting in a glass. He frowned. Perhaps it was nothing. Metal cooling, maybe. But still, he made a note in his mind to check the forward compartments in the morning. He looked upward again. The stars were so clear, they seemed close enough to touch. In their cold light, the deck gleamed like frost. He could see his breath in the air, curling like smoke. He pressed his hand against the railing. It was colder than before, almost biting. And for a fleeting moment, he imagined the ship beneath him not as a marvel, but as a creature. A great, breathing thing gliding through the dark. Too proud to realize the abyss below was older and wiser than any dream of man. He whispered into the night, "Don't trust the stillness. Nothing this calm ever lasts." His voice vanished into the air, swallowed by the vastness. Even the sea refused to echo it back. If you had been there beside him, standing in that silence that seemed to stretch forever, you might have felt it too. That fragile hum between serenity and foreboding. That moment when the world holds its breath before it breaks. And perhaps you would have asked yourself, what does quiet sound like just before destiny speaks? Do we ever recognize the last calm night? When we are living it, the wind did not answer. Neither did the sea. It only watched, patient, eternal, and impossibly still. Morning came pale and thin, the sun rising like a ghost through the mist. The sea remained glass-smooth, its surface so calm that even the gulls seemed reluctant to disturb it. From the bridge, the horizon looked infinite, serene, empty, deceptive. Thomas Andrews sipped his tea slowly, his eyes fixed on the chart table. A thin line traced Titanic's course westward, neat and certain. But now, the wireless operator had begun to deliver small interruptions. fragments of Morse code tapped out from distant ships that had seen something the charts did not show. Ice reported, latitude 41 degrees 46 foot north. Large bergs sighted near the steamer track. Proceed with caution. The messages came from the Baltic, the Caronia, the Californian. Each one arrived like a breath of cold air entering a warm room. Captain Smith read them quietly, nodded, and ordered them logged. Routine, nothing more. But Andrews did not see routine. He saw probability, accumulation, and inevitability. He picked up one of the messages, running his fingers over the pencil translation. The word iceberg seemed to stand out as if the page itself were chilled. "Should we alter course?" he asked. Smith shook his head gently. "The weather's perfect, visibility excellent. We'll maintain speed and watch for reports." His tone was calm, practiced, the confidence of a man who had crossed the Atlantic 20 times without incident. Andrews nodded, but his gaze lingered on the map longer than it should have. He could feel the ship vibrating faintly under his feet, her heartbeat steady, powerful. 30,000 horses pushing west, too fast, he thought, for a world still ruled by the sea. By noon, the temperature had dropped. Passengers wrapped themselves in coats and scarves as they walked the deck. Frost sparkled on the railings, and the air had that peculiar clarity that comes only when cold meets salt. Andrews walked among them, smiling politely when spoken to, but his mind was elsewhere, on hull plates, rivets, stress tolerances, and the thousand details that made perfection so fragile. He stopped beside a group of children pressing their faces to the glass of the promenade. They were laughing, their breath fogging the window as they pretended to draw shapes in the frost. "Look, Mama," one of them said. "It's like snow." The mother smiled. "Not snow, dear. Just the sea breathing cold." Andrews almost smiled at that. The sea breathing cold. Yes, he thought. That's exactly what it is. He descended below deck after lunch, making his rounds through the engine room and the mail hold. The men working there were stripped to their undershirts, sweating in the heat of the boilers, unaware of how close they were to a world made entirely of ice. He spoke briefly with the chief engineer, Joseph Bell, a calm man with eyes like dark iron. "Engines running smooth," Bell said. "She's a marvel, sir. I've never seen her equal." Andrews nodded, but there was no pride in his expression, only responsibility. Later that afternoon, another wireless message arrived. "America reports 2 large icebergs on the steamer track." Phillips, the wireless operator, brought it to the bridge. His face was flushed from long hours at the key. Smith accepted it, read it, and tucked it into his pocket. When Andrews asked about it later, Smith smiled faintly. "We're in no danger tonight. The sea's too calm for worry." Andrews looked out at that glassy horizon, where the air and water blended into a single stillness. Too calm, he thought again. Always too calm before the fall. That night, as he returned to his cabin, he opened his leather notebook and wrote a single line at the top of the page. Technology cannot replace humility. He stared at the words for a long moment before closing the book. Outside, the temperature dropped further. Frost gathered along the railings like lace. From the crow's nest, the lookouts shivered in the cold, their breath turning to mist. The sea, once black, now shimmered faintly under starlight, smooth as glass, silent as prayer. And if anyone had leaned over the side of the ship at that hour, they might have seen it, just for an instant, a pale shape on the horizon, motionless and enormous, glinting faintly in the moonlight, not approaching, not threatening, simply waiting. And somewhere deep inside the Titanic, Thomas Andrews dreamed of the sea, and heard again that faint, low whisper from beneath the music, as if the ocean were trying, in its slow, eternal language, to speak one last warning before the world refused to listen. The night of April 14th began like any other, calm, cold, and beautiful beyond reason. The sky was so clear that it seemed every star ever born had gathered above the Titanic, watching her glide through the dark like a silver blade across a field of glass. Passengers marveled at the stillness. "It's like floating in the heavens," one woman whispered. And in a way, she was right. The sea was so flat it reflected the stars perfectly, creating the illusion that the ship was sailing between two skies, one above, one below, with nothing but belief separating them. But among the officers on the bridge, that beauty carried unease. First Officer Murdoch watched the thermometer fall steadily, the mercury dropping lower each hour. The air was sharp now, the kind of cold that cuts through fabric and skin alike. When he rubbed his gloved hands together, they made a faint rasping sound, dry as frost. Thomas Andrews joined them just before 10 p.m., coat buttoned to his throat, eyes bright with quiet concern. He had been reviewing notes in his cabin, but the sense of stillness had drawn him back on deck. He stepped out into the cold and paused, listening. It was the same silence he'd heard 2 nights before, vast, perfect, absolute. The engines hummed faintly beneath him, but above that, the air was so still it seemed the world had stopped breathing. "Visibility's excellent," said Murdoch. "You could spot a candle flame 10 miles away." Andrews nodded slowly. "Yes, if the candle moved." Murdoch frowned, unsure what he meant. Andrews gestured toward the horizon. When the sea's calm like this, it hides things. No waves breaking against obstacles. No foam to catch the light. It's deceptive, like staring into polished obsidian. The officer nodded, silent. The words hung in the cold air like mist. Inside the crow's nest, high above the deck, Lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee stamped their feet to stay warm. They had been on watch since 10 o'clock, eyes straining into the darkness. Their binoculars were still locked away, a simple oversight that would later become a footnote in history. But for now, they had only their eyes and the faint gleam of starlight. From the bridge, Captain Smith emerged, wrapped in a heavy coat. His face, lined and weathered, looked calm, almost serene. He stood beside Andrews and gazed into the distance, the faint hum of the engines filling the silence between them. "Still water," Smith murmured. "I've never seen the Atlantic so calm." Andrews nodded. "Too calm, sir." They shared a long look, not fear, not yet, but something older, a sailor's instinct, the quiet knowledge that the ocean never offers gifts without asking something in return. At 10:30 p.m., the Californians sent a final message by wireless. "We are stopped and surrounded by ice." Jack Phillips, in the wireless room, was busy with passenger telegrams. He tapped out his reply impatiently. "Shut up. I'm busy." Then he returned to a stack of messages. Outside his small cabin, the sea stretched silently toward that same ice field. On deck, the temperature dropped again. Frost glittered along the railings, and thin ice began to form on the rigging. Andrews rubbed his thumb along the metal handrail and felt it bite with cold. He looked up, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw something. Far ahead, against the starlit horizon, a shape, faint, enormous, motionless. It could have been a cloud, a shadow, a trick of the eye. He blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling remained, that somewhere in the darkness, something vast and patient waited, not moving, not threatening, simply being. He turned toward the bridge. "Captain," he began, then hesitated. Smith raised an eyebrow. "Yes, Mr. Andrews?" Andrews exhaled slowly, his breath turning to fog in the freezing air. "Nothing, sir. Just a strange night for smooth sailing." The captain smiled faintly. "She's a good ship, built by the best. I trust her." Andrews forced a nod, but his eyes drifted back to the horizon. The reflection of the stars rippled faintly on the black water, and for a moment he imagined one of those stars falling, not from the sky, but from below. If you had stood beside him then, you might have felt it too, that almost imperceptible change in the air, the stillness that feels alive, as if the night itself were listening. And maybe you would have asked yourself, what if the ocean does not attack? What if it only waits for us to come too close? A clock chimed 11. The lookouts adjusted their scarves and squinted into the dark. And somewhere out there, Unseen and unmoving, the invisible mountain of ice floated quietly beneath the stars, as if the sea itself had raised a monument to human confidence and was waiting patiently for the moment to unveil it. It began not with a crash, but with a whisper, a sound so soft, most aboard never heard it at all. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic met the sea's secret. A long, low scrape, metal brushing against ice. A shiver through the steel that ran the entire length of the ship like a sigh. In the crow's nest, Lookout Frederick Fleet leaned forward, his heart lurching. He had seen it seconds before, a pale shape rising suddenly out of the blackness, so close that it seemed to grow out of the stars themselves. "Iceberg, right ahead," he shouted into the phone. The warning echoed down to the bridge. First Officer Murdoch reacted instantly. "Hard to starboard," he ordered. Then, full astern. The helmsman spun the wheel. The engines reversed. But momentum, that invisible tyrant of physics, does not forgive hesitation. From the deck, passengers felt only a gentle vibration beneath their feet. A faint shudder, like distant thunder beneath a calm sea. China rattled softly in cabinets. In the smoking lounge, a few men paused their cards, glanced around, and shrugged. Some smiled. Probably just the engines, someone said. Thomas Andrews, in his cabin, felt it too. Not loud, not violent, just wrong. He stood instantly, notebook still in his hand, and stepped into the corridor. The air felt different, heavy somehow, as if the ship itself had exhaled and was waiting to see what would happen next. On the bridge, Captain Smith appeared within moments. His eyes moved from Murdoch to the helmsman to the compass. "What have we hit?" Murdoch's answer was quiet. "An iceberg, sir." No panic, no shouting, just a simple truth, carried on frozen air. Andrews arrived seconds later. He looked over the rail. Ice fragments littered the forward well deck, glittering in the moonlight like shards of glass. A single block of ice lay wedged against the railing, glistening like a jewel. He touched it. It burned. He turned toward the bridge. "Have the carpenters sound the ship," he said calmly. Then he disappeared below. Down in the mail hold, water was already pouring in. Cold, relentless, silver under the electric lamps. The postal clerks, still sorting mail for New York, watched as it rose around their boots. They moved the bags to higher shelves without understanding that no shelf would ever be high enough. Andrews moved quickly from compartment to compartment, notebook in hand, eyes scanning the rivets, the seams, the lines of flow. When he reached the sixth compartment, he stopped. He didn't need measurements, he knew. 5 compartments breached. The limit was 4. He closed his notebook slowly, as if by doing so he might delay the inevitable. Then he whispered, not to anyone in particular. "She will go down, she must." On the bridge, Captain Smith listened as Andrews explained what the waterline would do, how it would rise, how it would spill from one bulkhead to the next like a staircase of doom. He spoke quietly, methodically, like a man reciting his own eulogy. "How long?" Smith asked. Andrews looked toward the horizon, still calm, still bright with stars. "An hour and a half, 2 at most." The captain nodded once, then softly, "Very well. Send out the distress call." At that same moment, on the lower decks, crewmen were waking passengers. "Just a precaution," they said. "Nothing to worry about." The words were kind, practiced, meant to calm, but the tone carried something else, disbelief. And above them all, the Titanic continued forward for a few hundred yards more, as if reluctant to accept her fate. Then her engines stopped. The great hum that had filled her heart since Southampton faded into silence. And in that silence, a new sound began, the whisper of water, seeping, rushing, climbing. From the promenade, the stars seemed closer than ever. Passengers stepped out onto the deck, puzzled by the stillness. Some pointed to the ice, still clinging to the foredeck. Others laughed softly, their breath silver in the night air. If you had been there, standing among them, you might have looked up at the sky, and felt that strange illusion again, that the ship was floating not on water, but between two heavens. And perhaps you would have asked yourself, quietly, how can a world end so quietly? When does noise become silence, and silence become a warning? Far below, the ocean continued its slow work, patient and unhurried, as it always is. It was not anger. It was not vengeance. It was only nature, fulfilling its law, indifferent to human faith. And as the cold crept upward through steel and silence, Thomas Andrews stood once more in the companionway, his hand against the wall of his creation. Listening to the heartbeat that was already slowing, he closed his eyes, and for the first time since the ship's launch, he felt her breathe, not as an engine, but as something alive and dying. The bridge had become a cathedral of calm. No shouting, no chaos, only the quiet rustle of uniforms, the clink of brass instruments, and the low murmur of men who understood that every word now mattered. Captain Smith stood in the center, his silver beard faintly catching the lamplight. He looked toward Thomas Andrews, who had just returned from below, his boots soaked, his eyes hollow with knowledge. Smith's voice was steady. "Mr. Andrews, how much time do we have?" Andrews hesitated only a moment. "An hour and a half, perhaps 2. "No more, sir." The captain nodded. Then, in that same measured tone that had carried ships safely across oceans for decades, he said the words that would echo through history. "Very well. Prepare the lifeboats." No alarm bells, no running feet, just orders, passed from man to man, calm, precise, inevitable. The engines were silent now, and without their hum, the vastness of the night seemed to close in. The sea stretched flat and black in every direction, a mirror that reflected the ship's lights in trembling gold. From the wireless room came the sharp clicks of distress. CQD. CQD, then SOS. The first time that signal had ever been used in a real disaster. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride sent it over and over, their fingers stiff from the cold, their faces pale in the glow of the transmitter. "Come at once. We have struck an iceberg, sinking fast." Miles away, aboard the Carpathia, a young wireless operator sat up straight. He read the message twice before running for his captain. Help was coming, but hours away. On the Titanic, the clock kept moving. Andrews walked quickly through the corridors, urging crewmen to open the lifeboat covers, to gather women and children. He paused only once, at the grand staircase, where the clock above the landing ticked with cruel steadiness. Each second sounded louder than the last. In the first-class dining room, passengers were still dressed in evening clothes. Some joked, some complained about the cold. "Surely, this is only a precaution," one man said, adjusting his cufflinks. "Yes," another replied with a laugh. "She's unsinkable, after all." Andrews stopped beside them. His voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "Ladies and gentlemen, please put on your life jackets. You'll be safer on deck." He said it with such quiet authority that they obeyed without question. He moved on, his reflection flickering across polished mirrors, a man walking calmly through the last hours of his creation. On deck, sailors worked by lamplight, swinging out the great white boats. The ropes groaned under strain, pulleys creaked softly, and the cold air carried the faint smell of salt and oil. Captain Smith appeared among them, his face unreadable. "Women and children first," he said simply. No one argued. No one dared. Far below, the male clerks still fought the rising water, trying to save bags of letters that would never be delivered. In the boiler rooms, engineers stayed at their posts, feeding the furnaces to keep the lights burning. They knew the heat would buy minutes, minutes that meant lives. Above, the band began to play. Softly at first, light, comforting melodies meant to steady trembling hands. The notes drifted through the cold air, spilling down stairways and across the black water like fragile threads of hope. Andrews paused on the port side, watching as the first lifeboat was lowered. Half empty, He closed his eyes, fighting the urge to shout. But he understood. Panic would do no good now. Calm would save more lives than fear ever could. He turned to one of the stewards beside him. "Make sure the women are wrapped well," he said quietly. "It's bitter cold tonight." The steward nodded. His breath came out in small clouds. The stars above seemed impossibly close, so bright they shimmered on the tiers, freezing against his lashes. Captain Smith walked past, stopping briefly beside Andrews. "You've done your duty, Mr. Andrews." Andrews shook his head gently. "No, sir, not yet." They looked at one another. Two men bound by creation and responsibility, standing beneath the indifferent beauty of the heavens. If you had been there, standing in that golden glow of lanterns and starlight, you might have felt it, the strange grace that sometimes comes before despair, and maybe you would have whispered to yourself, "How does courage sound when it wears silence as its armor? Can calm itself become an act of defiance?" The captain turned toward the sea. "Gentlemen," he said softly to his officers, "it's every man's duty now. God help us all." And as the wind began to rise, the unsinkable ship leaned ever so slightly toward the waiting dark, her decks glowing like a city drifting into eternity. The ropes creaked softly, a dull groan of metal, a whisper of pulley against pulley, and the first lifeboat began its slow descent toward the black, freezing sea. No one screamed. Not yet. There was confusion, murmurs, disbelief, but not fear. It was too soon for fear. Boat number 7 went down at 12:45 a.m. There was room for 65 souls, but only 28 sat within its wooden frame. The others, hundreds of them, still stood on deck, clutching railings, watching, waiting for someone to tell them it wasn't real. Thomas Andrews moved between them like a quiet current, his voice low, measured, almost tender. "This way, please. Ladies and children first." His words carried through the cold, steady as the heartbeat of a man who had already accepted the truth. Captain Smith stood near the bridge, his eyes sweeping the deck, not with panic, but with an awful clarity. He knew what Andrews knew, and still he stayed silent. A captain does not speak doom aloud. The sea was calm, too calm. The surface reflected the ship's lights like molten glass, so that when the first boat touched the water, it looked as though it were sinking into liquid gold. On the upper decks, laughter still echoed faintly. Some passengers, wrapped in furs, refused to believe the danger. One woman asked, almost amused, "Surely, this is just an exercise?" A steward smiled, bowing slightly. "Of course, madam. Merely a precaution." But the look in his eyes betrayed him. He couldn't meet hers. Andrews watched as another boat swung outward. The ropes stiffened, the davits groaned, and the wind carried the smell of cold metal and salt. He saw hesitation in the faces of the men at the winches, the understanding that each boat lowered meant fewer left for those above. He turned toward the bridge. The band was playing now, soft waltzes drifting through the cold air. The notes trembled like frost upon glass. A melody of denial, perhaps, or mercy. The next lifeboat, number 5, lowered unevenly. One end dipped sharply before the sailors steadied it. A baby began to cry. A mother shushed it, whispering words that vanished in the wind. Someone asked, "Will we be coming back?" No one answered. From the crow's nest above, Fleet and Lee watched the scene unfold below. Lanterns swinging, shadows crossing. A silent ballet of order in the face of disaster. Andrews moved again among the passengers. He found Mrs. Ryerson searching for her husband, and the young Astors standing together, still hand in hand. He spoke gently, as if soothing a child. "There will be room for you. Please go now." But Madeline Astor hesitated. Her husband touched her arm. "Go, my dear." She looked at him, eyes wet. "Not without you." He smiled, that quiet, hopeless smile of men who already know they are ghosts. Andrews looked away. He could not bear to see the same story written again and again on every face. At 1 a.m., More boats went down. Numbers 3, 1, and 8. Some half empty, others overcrowded. In the flickering light, the sea seemed almost kind, its stillness a cruel mercy. The cries of orders blended with music, with the hiss of steam, with the strange, rhythmic sound of water creeping below. Above it all, the stars shone like indifferent witnesses. Their cold light fell on steel, on fear, on courage. If you had stood there, perhaps you would have felt the strange contradiction. How beauty can exist inside tragedy. How the end of the world can look like peace. And maybe you would have asked yourself, when do we decide that safety is real? How long can we stand on a sinking ship and call it unsinkable? Andrews paused near the last boat on the starboard side. He rested one hand on its wooden rim. The paint was cold beneath his fingers. He looked out toward the horizon, the black ocean stretching forever. The line between sky and water vanished. He thought of the shipyards in Belfast, of the men who had built this vessel with their hands in pride and sweat. He whispered to no one, "She was perfect until we believed she could not fail." The next lifeboat descended slowly into the abyss. The ropes hissed, and the wooden hull dipped beneath the reflection of the stars. And somewhere below, the ocean waited, silent, patient, cradling each boat it received, while the great ship above continued to lean, inch by inch, toward the dark embrace that would claim her. At first, no one noticed the music. It drifted faintly through the corridors, barely audible above the creak of ropes and the murmured voices of officers giving orders. But as the night deepened and the lifeboats descended one by one into the Black Sea, the sound began to spread, a fragile melody threading through the cold. 8 men, led by Wallace Hartley, stood together on the forward deck. They were dressed neatly in their uniforms, their instruments glinting faintly beneath the lamps. No one had told them to play. They simply understood that silence would be worse. The first notes were calm, a waltz, Songe d'Automne. The kind of tune passengers had danced to just hours earlier, beneath chandeliers and laughter. Now it floated into the freezing night, transforming the chaos into something eerily peaceful. A woman clutching her child paused at the sound, her tears catching the lamplight. "They're still playing," she whispered. A sailor nodded quietly. God bless him for it." Thomas Andrews heard the music as he moved along the deck, helping passengers into the remaining boats. The melody followed him, faint but unwavering, a reminder of the world as it had been, and as it would never be again. He stopped beside the grand staircase and listened. The notes carried through the ship like smoke, curling through the air vents, echoing off the marble, rising above the sound of rushing water below. For a moment, everything seemed suspended. The panic, the noise, the cold. Only the music lived. Captain Smith stood near the bridge, his hat in his hands. When one of his officers approached, asking for further orders, he only shook his head softly. Let them play. Down below, in the boiler rooms, the engineers still worked by lamplight, sweat freezing on their brows. Their engines keeping the ship's lights alive just a little longer, so the music could continue. On the boat deck, a passenger turned to Andrews. "Do they not know?" the man asked, voice trembling. Andrews looked toward the musicians, their faces calm, their hands steady despite the cold. "Oh, they know," he said softly. "That's why they play." The waltz ended. Then another began, Alexander's ragtime band. For a moment, there was laughter again, fragile and desperate, the kind of laughter that comes when the heart cannot bear more fear. But soon the rhythm slowed. The choices grew gentler, humbler. Music not for celebration, but for farewell. The violin's tone grew thinner as frost gathered on the strings. Hartley lifted his bow, met the eyes of his fellow players, and began the hymn that would outlive them all. "Nearer, my God, to thee." The notes rose into the stillness, soft, imperfect, trembling with cold. Passengers stopped. Crewmen paused mid-task. Even the sea seemed to hold its breath. It was no longer a song. It was a prayer. Andrews stood motionless, his breath visible in the pale air, his eyes glistening as he listened to the sound his ship carried so gracefully toward eternity. One by one, lifeboats pulled away, their occupants turning back to look at the glowing silhouette of the ship and the faint music that followed them across the waves. Many would later say that, even miles away, they could still hear it, the thin, trembling voice of civilization itself, refusing to die quietly. If you had been there, you might have closed your eyes and wondered, what gives men the strength to sing at the edge of death? Is it courage or something gentler? A final act of love for the world they must leave behind? The hymn carried on, each note rising higher, thinner, until it seemed to dissolve into the stars themselves. And as the last chord faded, the wind answered, softly, almost tenderly, as though the sea, too, were listening and mourning. By 2 in the morning, the Titanic was no longer level with the sea. Her bow had disappeared beneath the black surface, and her stern now pointed toward the stars, as though reaching for salvation that would never come. Yet still, her lights glowed, golden squares of warmth across a ship already half in darkness. They flickered through the freezing mist, a vision so strange and beautiful that even those in the lifeboats could not look away. Thomas Andrews stood on the boat deck, his hair damp with frost, his breath steady. All around him, passengers moved like sleepwalkers. Some prayed, some waited, some simply stared upward, their faces pale against the cold sky, their eyes reflecting both starlight and electric fire. The music had stopped now. Only the sea sang, a low, endless hymn. From below came the steady, merciless sound of water, pouring, rushing, breaking through doorways, claiming one deck after another. Andrews made one last round. He checked the cabins, the stairways, the smoking rooms. In the first-class lounge, chairs still stood neatly around tables, cards mid-game, glasses half full. He touched one of the mahogany doors as he passed. The varnish was cold, smooth as glass. A young steward approached, trembling. "Sir, what should we do now?" Andrews looked at him gently. "Do your duty," he said, "and pray if you can." The steward nodded and ran off. Andrews lingered a moment longer, watching the reflections of the lights ripple across the water, pooling along the floor. He could see his own face in that reflection, pale, blurred, almost ghost-like. Outside, the night had turned into something surreal. The stars burned fiercely, mirrored in the sea until it seemed there was no up or down, only infinity, cold, beautiful, merciless. In Lifeboat 6, Molly Brown clutched the oar. Her breath came in small clouds. She looked back at the ship, glowing faintly against the blackness, and whispered, "God help them." The other women in the boat turned too, their faces lit by that haunting golden glow, the light of civilization sinking quietly beneath the waves. Aboard the ship, the lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized for a while. The engineers below were still at their posts, hands frozen to the controls, keeping power running as long as human will could defy the ocean's advance. Captain Smith stood on the bridge, his hands clasped behind his back. He stared at the horizon, a line that no longer existed, and in that moment, he looked almost peaceful. Some said he gave one last order. Others said he said nothing at all. But those who saw him last remembered his face illuminated by the dying glow of the bridge lamps, the face of a man who had stopped commanding and begun accepting. Andrews made his way to the first-class smoking room. It was empty now, except for a single lamp still burning beside a painting of a quiet countryside. He paused before it, removing his life jacket and setting it gently on the table. The carpet was wet beneath his shoes, the air heavy with salt and cold. He sat for a moment, his hands folded loosely, his gaze fixed on the painting. A green field under a summer sky. Outside, the sound grew louder, a deep, groaning cry of steel surrendering to pressure. The ship's body trembled, glass shattered. A clock somewhere chimed its last second, and then, Darkness. Every light on the Titanic blinked out at once. The sudden blackness was absolute. It felt like the universe itself had exhaled and swallowed the ship whole. Those in the lifeboats gasped. Some screamed. Others just stared at the spot where the golden glow had been, until their eyes filled with tears that froze on their lashes. For a few seconds, the world seemed to stop existing. Only stars remained, endless, unblinking, reflected in the glassy sea. And in that mirrored sky, the Titanic hung, neither ship nor dream, but a fading idea dissolving into the deep. If you had been there, drifting on the waves, watching the last light vanish, you might have felt that strange, impossible thought. Perhaps it was not the ship that sank into the sea, but the world that sank into silence. And in that silence, a few faint cries began, distant, human, fragile. The sound of life continuing even as creation itself seemed to pause. The stars above did not flicker. They watched, cold and eternal, as the final lights of the Titanic faded forever beneath their reflection. For a few heartbeats after the lights went out, there was nothing. No sound, no motion, only darkness, thick, total, infinite. Then came the sound. It began deep within the ship. A low, thunderous groan, the voice of iron bending against inevitability. The Titanic, still half above water, trembled like a wounded creature. The steel frames that had once held her proudly together began to twist, rivets popping like gunfire beneath the waves. From the lifeboats, the survivors watched in stunned silence. The massive stern, rising higher every second, gleamed faintly in starlight. You could still read the name, Titanic, letters of iron defying gravity for the last time. And then the sound deepened. A roar. A scream of torn metal that rolled across the Atlantic like the breaking of the world. The ship's back split between the third and fourth funnels. A wall of spray exploded into the air. People clung to the railings, their silhouettes lit by the faint glimmer of the stars. For one horrifying instant, the Titanic seemed to resist, as if refusing to let go of herself. Then, with a crack that echoed for miles, she tore apart. The bow plunged instantly, swallowed by the sea with a hiss and a rumble. The stern, still filled with trapped air, fell back into the water, slamming down with such force that waves surged out in every direction. Some said they could feel the heat of the explosion like impact. Others swore the ocean itself shuddered. Thomas Andrews was gone by then. No one saw him again after the lights failed, but a steward later swore that just before the break, he had glimpsed a glow in the first-class lounge, the faint flicker of a single lamp, and a figure sitting quietly beneath it. As the stern steadied itself for a brief moment, the ship seemed almost alive again, a ghost refusing to sink. Men and women still clung to the railings, their voices rising in a desperate, wordless chorus that no one could ever forget. Then gravity claimed what the sea had begun. The stern tilted higher, furniture and bodies sliding down the decks like leaves in the wind. One of the funnels collapsed, crushing lifeboats and hurling sparks into the sky. The noise was deafening, a symphony of breaking glass, rending steel, and human cries carried on the freezing wind. And yet, through it all, some swore they heard something else. Not screams, not thunder, music, a single note, a violin, faint, trembling, carried on the wind between the roars of the dying ship. Just one tone, drawn across a frozen string, like a final exhale from a soul refusing silence. It might have been imagination, or memory, or perhaps the ocean remembering what courage sounded like. At 2:17 a.m., the stern rose vertical against the sky. For a brief, surreal moment, the Titanic stood upright, a black silhouette against a field of silver stars. Then, with a slow, solemn motion, she began her final descent. People slid down her decks into the dark. Some jumped, some prayed. Most simply held on, not because they believed they would live, but because letting go felt too much like giving up on life itself. The ship sank straight down, the water swallowing her lights, her music, her stories. The sound that followed, that deep, hollow roar as the Atlantic closed over her, was unlike anything heard before or since. And then, there was nothing. Only the wind, only the stars, only the sound of the sea reclaiming its stillness. In the lifeboats, silence fell again. Every man and woman turned toward the darkness where the ship had been, their faces lit only by starlight. No one spoke. The night had become too enormous for words. If you had been there, floating on that frozen black water, you might have felt that this was not an ending, but a transformation, as though something vast had passed from the world of men into the memory of the sea. And maybe you would have asked yourself, in a whisper meant only for the waves, when a great dream dies, does it make a sound, or does it simply become the ocean? At first, there was noise, a terrible human noise, 1,000 voices rising at once, a chorus of fear and desperation that carried across miles of still water. It began just after the Titanic disappeared. The sound came from everywhere, faint at first, then swelling, until it filled the night. Men, women, and children scattered among the wreckage, clinging to chairs, doors, and pieces of the great ship now broken beneath the waves. Their cries overlapped, raw and pleading, echoing beneath the same stars that had watched in silence as the ship went down. The lifeboats drifted nearby, their occupants staring into the dark, hands pressed over their mouths, faces white with disbelief. The sound was unbearable, not because it was loud, but because it was alive. "Row back," someone whispered. "Please, we have to go back." But no one moved. Quartermaster Hitchens gripped the tiller of Lifeboat 6, his knuckles bone white. "The suction will take us under," he muttered. "If we go back, we all die." Beside him, Molly Brown leaned forward, her breath visible in the freezing air. "There are people out there," she said. "They're dying." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from fury. Still, the oars stayed still. Boat by boat, the same argument, the same choice between courage and survival. Only one, Lifeboat 14, under 5th Officer Lowe, turned back. By the time they did, the cries had already begun to fade. Thomas Andrews was gone, Captain Smith gone, the ship itself gone, and yet the sound of it lingered in the air, like an echo that refused to die. Lifeboat 14 rode through the wreckage. Bodies floated face up beneath the stars, their life jackets glowing faintly white against the black sea. Wood suitcases, pieces of railing, all drifting together in a slow, silent dance. "Anyone alive?" Lowe shouted. His voice cracked the air. No answer, only the faint lapping of waves against wood. And somewhere far off, a single voice, weak, desperate, calling out in a language no one recognized. When they found him, the man was clinging to a piece of wreckage, his hands frozen to the wood. He was Chinese, one of a handful of laborers traveling in 3rd class. He had survived where so many others had not. A small, stubborn proof that life sometimes chooses at random. Lowe pulled him into the boat. Then silence returned. The cries were gone now. One by one, they had faded, each extinguished by the cold, until the ocean was quiet again. Too quiet. The survivors sat motionless, listening to the stillness that followed. The sound of death had vanished, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than any scream. Miles away, icebergs floated, tall, ghostly, their white shapes glowing in the starlight. They looked almost beautiful, almost holy. In one of the boats, a woman began to pray aloud. Her voice was soft, trembling, the words blending with the soft lap of the sea. Another joined in, then another, until the prayers became one long whisper, a fragile rhythm against the eternal stillness. And if you had been there, floating in that silence, you might have realized the truth the sea had always known. That sound fades, that warmth dies, but silence endures, because silence is not empty. It remembers every voice, every breath, every heartbeat that once dared to echo against the vastness. And in that memory, the Titanic still lives, not as steel or luxury or pride, but as sound, the echo of humanity carried forever within the dark lungs of the sea. If you closed your eyes then, you might have heard it still, faint, distant, almost like music, a low hum in the water, half wind, half sorrow, the sound of a dream sinking, but not forgotten. For hours, the sea had been nothing but shadow, an endless mirror of black water and colder sky. The cries had faded, the wind had softened, and the survivors sat motionless, waiting for either death or rescue, whichever reached them first. Then slowly, the dark began to change. At first it was only a suggestion, a faint line of silver on the horizon, so fragile it could have been imagined. Then came the color, pale gold, soft gray, the first bruised hues of morning. Dawn. The survivors lifted their heads. Frost clung to their hair, their clothes stiff with salt and ice. They turned toward the east, toward that faint, trembling light, and for the first time since midnight, the world looked alive again. The Titanic was gone. Only pieces of her remained. A chair, a door, a child's toy drifting on the water. But the sea was still, as though she were ashamed of what she had done. In Lifeboat 6, Molly Brown held the oars with numb hands. Her breath came out in soft, rhythmic clouds. "Look," someone whispered beside her. She turned, and there, far on the horizon, was a spark, a single point of light. At first, it flickered like a star. Then another appeared beside it. Then another, until the faint outline of a ship began to form. Gray, distant, moving steadily toward them. The Carpathia. Someone breathed. A sob rippled through the boat. Then laughter. Then the sound of quiet weeping. From every lifeboat, figures rose to their feet, waving scarves, jackets, anything they could find. Some were too weak to stand. They simply lifted their hands to the sky. It was not joy, not yet, just the fragile, trembling disbelief of the living. The Carpathia drew closer, her smokestacks faintly lit by the morning sun. On her deck, sailors prepared ropes and blankets, their faces pale with shock as they saw the hundreds waiting. In Lifeboat 14, Fifth Officer Lowe straightened his back. His voice cracked as he shouted across the water. "Hold on. Help's here." The sea, once cruel, now seemed calm again. Waves lapped gently against the boats, as if guiding them toward salvation. Andrews was gone. Captain Smith was gone. The great ship that had once ruled the ocean was now part of it, a memory buried beneath 12,000 feet of cold silence. But her survivors, the 700 souls who floated above her grave, were the proof that something within the human spirit had refused to drown. As the Carpathia approached, the first rays of sunlight touched the faces of the living. They blinked against the brightness, squinting as though seeing daylight for the first time. The ocean shimmered gold where hours before it had been black. The color of grief had become the color of survival. On deck, Captain Rostron of the Carpathia stood at the rail, his coat whipping in the cold wind. He had pushed his ship beyond safe speed to reach them. Now, seeing the faces rising from the lifeboats, he felt his throat close. There were no words left, only duty. The ropes dropped. Hands reached upward. One by one, the survivors were lifted from the boats, frozen, silent, half in shock, but alive. And as they came aboard, many turned back toward the horizon. There was nothing there now, only the empty sea, calm, glittering beneath the rising sun. Somewhere below that glowing water, a great ship slept, and perhaps, in that first light of dawn, the sea whispered her name softly, not with guilt, but remembrance. If you had been there, watching that sunrise break over the Atlantic, you might have understood why people said that morning light never looked the same again. Because when the world has watched perfection sink, even dawn feels different. And maybe you would have asked yourself, what does hope look like after loss? Is it warmth returning, or simply the refusal to die cold? The Carpathia's horn sounded once, deep, mournful, echoing across the quiet sea. And in that sound, there was both an ending and a beginning. The world before the Titanic, and the world after. The sea that had swallowed the Titanic only hours before now lay still, its surface glass-smooth beneath the pale dawn. What had been horror in the night was now quiet, an almost sacred silence, broken only by the sound of oars and the deep hum of the approaching ship. The Carpathia loomed through the morning haze, her hull black and gleaming with condensation, a guardian emerging from the void. Crewmen leaned over her rails, faces pale, eyes wide, as they looked down upon the hundreds drifting in open boats. Each lifeboat told a different story, some filled with women huddled together for warmth, others silent, staring blankly at the horizon, their eyes fixed on something only they could still see. A few held the wounded, their bandaged hands frozen stiff against their coats. All of them had that same expression. Not triumph, not joy, but something quieter. Survival, still too heavy to feel like a gift. Ropes were thrown, blankets lowered. The voices of the Carpathia's sailors rose through the cold. "Hold on, we've got you." One by one, they began to lift the survivors up the side of the ship. Hands reached out, trembling hands meeting steady ones. A cry here, a sob there, but mostly silence. The kind of silence that follows miracles. In one lifeboat, Molly Brown stood and waved to the rescuers. "Ladies first," she shouted hoarsely, her voice breaking from exhaustion and windburn. When one woman hesitated to climb the ladder, Molly steadied her with a gloved hand. "Come on now. You're safe. You made it. Up you go." She didn't climb until everyone else had. When she finally stepped aboard the Carpathia, her legs gave way beneath her. A sailor caught her arm. She managed a weak smile. "Hot coffee," she whispered. "That's all I need." The deck soon filled with survivors, women wrapped in blankets, children clutching the hands of strangers, men sitting silently with eyes fixed on nothing. Steam rose from cups of tea. Nurses moved among them with bandages and woolen scarves. Passengers of the Carpathia, woken from sleep by the rescue, offered their coats, their gloves, even their own cabins. One woman pressed a child to her chest. Another stared out over the rail, watching the empty sea where the great ship had vanished. "I saw her lights go out," she whispered to no one. "I'll never forget that." Molly Brown, her voice stronger now, moved from group to group, organizing aid. She spoke to the captain, to the crew, to anyone who would listen. "There are babies with no blankets. Tea for the women, and for God's sake, get those wet shoes off their feet before frostbite takes them." No one questioned her authority. In disaster, leadership finds its own way. Down below, the Carpathia's wireless operator tapped out the message that would soon circle the world. Picked up survivors of the Titanic, nearly 700 saved. The code clicked through the air, a heartbeat of hope pulsing across the Atlantic. In the quiet corners of the ship, others wept softly, for husbands, for sons, for friends who had not been among the rescued. Some clutched small keepsakes, a pocket watch, a glove, a locket still cold from the sea. The cost of survival weighed heavier than the blankets that covered them. Captain Rostron walked among the rescued, his breath misting in the air. He paused beside a young stewardess, wrapped in a blanket. "Rest now," he said quietly. "You're safe." She nodded, but didn't answer. Her eyes were open, staring at the deck beneath her, as if she could still see through it. Down into the black water below. Above, the sun climbed higher. The Atlantic turned from gray to blue. The icebergs that had been pale ghosts in the night now shone like marble cathedrals, beautiful and cruel in the morning light. As the Carpathia turned west toward New York, the survivors gathered along her railings. Behind them, the sea was empty once more. Only small pieces of debris floated. A chair, a violin case, a single life jacket rocking gently in the swell. If you had been there, you might have seen how the morning light, touched their faces, not to erase what had happened, but to remind them that even after the darkest night, the sun still rises. And perhaps you would have asked yourself, is survival its own kind of grace, or just another word for beginning again? The Carpathia moved on. The survivors watched until the last shimmer of wreckage faded from sight, their breath mingling with the cold morning air. And beneath them, somewhere in the deep, the Titanic slept, her lights extinguished, her hull silent, but her story still rising, carried on the surface by those who lived to tell it. On the evening of April 18th, 1912, the Carpathia reached New York Harbor. Rain fell, a soft, steady drizzle, turning the city's lights into long golden streaks against the mist. Thousands had gathered at the pier, their umbrellas pressed close together, faces pale in the glow of lanterns and camera flashes. The world had been waiting. For days, newspapers had printed lists, rumors and prayers, and now the waiting was over. The living were returning, but survival is never simple. When the Carpathia came into view, a hush fell over the crowd. No cheers, no celebration, only a low, collective breath. They saw not heroes, but ghosts. On deck, the survivors stood shoulder to shoulder under the rain. Their faces were hollow, their eyes red from sleeplessness and sea wind. The city ahead of them was bright alive, and yet to them, it felt impossibly far away. As the ship drew closer, the flashes of reporters' cameras began. Their bulbs flared like small bursts of lightning. The first storm the survivors had faced on land. Molly Brown stood near the railing, a blanket around her shoulders. When a photographer shouted her name, she turned her face away. "This isn't about me," she whispered. "There are others who should have come home." Behind her, women held photographs of husbands who would never return. Children pressed their faces into their mothers' coats. Crewmen stared down at the pier, their hands gripping the rail until their knuckles turned white. The gangways lowered with a slow metallic groan. The first survivors stepped ashore. Quietly, as if stepping into a dream, the crowd moved back to make way. Some reached out, touching wet sleeves, murmuring words of comfort no one could fully hear. Reporters swarmed, shouting questions. How did it happen? Who was to blame? Did the captain survive? But the survivors barely spoke. They walked past the voices, their footsteps echoing softly against the wooden dock. One woman stopped at the end of the gangway. She turned and looked back toward the harbor. There was nothing there. No light, no ship. Only fog and rain. She raised her hand as if in farewell, then lowered it again. No one asked to whom she had been waving. Inside the terminal, volunteers waited with blankets, soup, and hot tea. Doctors moved among the weak and the wounded. Church bells tolled slowly across the city, not for celebration, but for mourning. In one corner, a small group of survivors sat together in silence. They didn't know each other's names, but they shared a single memory: the sound of breaking steel, the music, the cries fading into night. Molly Brown found a quiet spot beside a child who sat alone. She wrapped the girl in her blanket. "Where's your mama?" she asked softly. The child shook her head. Molly didn't ask again. She just held her close until the trembling stopped. Outside, crowds still waited in the rain. Some cried with relief when they recognized a loved one. Others collapsed when they realized they never would. New York, a city built on movement, stood still for the first time in memory. By midnight, the last survivors had disembarked. The pier was scattered with forgotten things. A glove, a hat, a child's toy dropped in haste. A reporter bent down, picked up the toy, and stared at it for a long time before writing anything. In the distance, the Carpathia's horn sounded, long, low, mournful, and even the rain seemed to pause. If you had stood there, beneath the yellow lamps of that foggy April night, you might have seen that what arrived in New York was not just the survivors of a shipwreck, but the survivors of a belief that progress could conquer nature, that steel could outlast sea. That man was master of his own fate, and maybe you would have asked yourself, What truly returns from tragedy? The living or the lesson? And do we ever step off the ship, or do we carry it with us forever? The survivors dispersed into the rain, each step echoing softly against the wet pavement. Behind them, the Atlantic lay unseen, and beneath it, the Titanic slept, her lights gone, her hull still, but her story already beginning to rise toward eternity. In the weeks that followed the sinking of the Titanic, the world demanded answers. How could the greatest ship ever built, the pride of an empire, the symbol of a century's progress, vanish into the cold Atlantic in less than 3 hours? There were whispers of hubris, of greed, of men who trusted rivets and reputations more than the sea. And there were names, Ismay Smith Andrews, spoken with reverence or blame, depending on who was listening. Across the ocean, 2 great nations opened their courtrooms. In Washington, D.C., Senator William Alden Smith convened the American inquiry. In London, Lord Mersey presided over the British one. Between them lay the wreck of a dream, and 1,500 lost voices waiting for justice. The hearings began in April 1912. The survivors, pale and hollow-eyed, filed into ornate chambers where chandeliers glowed softly overhead. Their faces seemed out of place among the marble columns and carved wood. They had come from the dark, and now were being asked to explain it. The senators spoke of negligence. The ship had been traveling too fast through icy waters. The lookouts had no binoculars. The lifeboats, half empty, untested. The officers, untrained for panic. And the designers, too confident in steel. Witnesses took the stand one after another. J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, sat stiffly under the electric lamps. His once proud voice trembled. He described how he had helped women into boats, how no one had been waiting when he stepped aboard himself. But the room was cold to him, to the press. He was not a man who escaped. He was a man who fled. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe testified next, his voice steady, his Welsh accent sharp. He told of rowing back through the floating corpses, searching for any sound of life. He found one man, barely breathing, clinging to wreckage. I pulled him in, Lowe said quietly. It was all we could do. Second Officer Charles Lightoller followed. He had survived by clinging to an overturned collapsible boat. Now, in the hearing, he stood tall, the last officer left alive. His answers were crisp, loyal, almost military in tone. When asked why he had refused men entry to lifeboats, he replied simply, I obeyed orders. Women and children first. He did not flinch, though behind his eyes the memory flickered like a ghost. Others spoke too. Firemen, wireless operators, engineers, widows, each carrying their own fragment of the truth. Together, their testimonies formed something vast and tragic, a map of human error. But no single hand could be blamed. The sea had been too calm, the stars too bright, the warnings too routine, the faith in technology too deep. In the British inquiry, Lord Mersey's voice echoed in the Great Hall. He was a man of law, not sentiment. But even he paused before reading his conclusions. The loss of the Titanic, he said slowly, was due to collision with an iceberg, brought about by excessive speed, in dangerous waters. His words sounded clinical, an autopsy, not an elegy. Yet beneath the formality, the world understood something larger. This was not merely a tragedy of ice and steel. It was a tragedy of belief. The belief that mankind could master the natural world, and that progress was stronger than humility. Still, the hearings did bring change. For the first time, ships would be required to carry lifeboats for everyone aboard. Wireless radios would remain manned 24 hours a day. Ice patrols would be established to watch the Northern Sea. Rules written in grief, inked by salt water and sorrow. As one senator said quietly after the final session, perhaps the only unsinkable thing was our arrogance. When the hearings ended, the witnesses left the chamber one by one. Some never spoke of the disaster again. Others spent the rest of their lives trying to make sense of it. The courtrooms emptied, but the echo remained, a sound like the sea itself, rising and falling long after everyone had gone home. If you had stood in that room when the last gavel fell, you might have felt it, that strange stillness that follows truth. Not peace exactly, but a quiet acceptance that some questions were never meant to be answered, because perhaps the Titanic did not sink because she hit an iceberg, but because she carried within her the weight of everything humanity refused to doubt. And maybe that's the lesson the world tried to write down, not in the official report, but in the silence that came after. Years passed, but the name Titanic never drifted away. It lingered like a ghost ship, sailing through dreams and headlines, through lullabies and nightmares. People whispered it with awe, as though saying her name might conjure both beauty and sorrow at once. A century's pride had gone to the bottom of the sea, and somehow it made the whole world feel smaller. In London, children played with toy ships and whispered, "This one won't sink." In New York, the newspapers began to print her name in black borders, the same ink used for obituaries. In every port city, sailors paused before launching, looking to the horizon with quiet superstition. And yet, the story refused to stay tragic. It began to transform. From a disaster into a mirror, the Titanic became more than steel and steam. She became the reflection of everything humanity wanted to believe about itself. Our brilliance, our ambition, our tenderness in the face of failure. Museums were built, books were written, songs composed in memory of the lost. And slowly, the ship rose again, not from the seabed, but from the human heart. Every generation retold her story differently. The early ones spoke of heroism, of bands playing until the end, of captains standing firm, of gentlemen giving their seats away. Later generations spoke of inequality, of locked gates, of forgotten names in third class, of the quiet cruelty of a world divided by wealth even as it drowned together. And then came the modern storytellers, who found in her wreck not tragedy, but warning. Each era looked into the ocean and saw itself reflected there. For the Victorians, it was about the end of faith in progress. For the mid-century, a symbol of war and loss. For the late 20th century, a reminder that even the most magnificent creations can be undone by arrogance and chance. The Titanic became a floating scripture, a parable about the thin ice between pride and humility. In Belfast, the shipyard where she was built fell silent for decades. The cranes rusted, the slipways overgrown with grass. But the people never forgot. Each April, church bells rang across the harbor, their chimes echoing out to sea like an apology. In 1985, 73 years after the sinking, a team led by Dr. Robert Ballard found her resting place, 2 miles beneath the surface. The world held its breath as the first grainy images appeared, the bow still proud, the railings covered in rust, the name still legible beneath a century of salt and silence. And once again, the Titanic spoke, not in words, but in what she had become, a city of ghosts, a cathedral of human ambition and sorrow, a place where time itself had stopped. The explorers moved through her halls with cameras and lights, their beams cutting through the darkness like prayers. Chairs still stood where they had been left. A child's shoe rested on the silt. The grand staircase had collapsed, its marble turned to dust. One diver later said, "It felt like walking through the afterlife of civilization itself." From those images, a new fascination was born. Movies, documentaries, exhibitions, each a different way of asking the same question. Why does this story still move us? Maybe because it isn't about a ship at all. It's about us, about the thin line between control and chaos, between the brilliance of our inventions and the fragility of our humanity. The Titanic became a lesson carved in water, a story every generation would rewrite, so it wouldn't have to repeat. And if you listen carefully, you can still hear her, not in the roar of the sea, but in the quiet moments when technology trembles, when nature reminds us she is watching. What do we build our faith on? Steel or compassion? Progress or wisdom? Do we chase perfection, or do we learn to live with our limits? The ship's rusting hull cannot answer, but maybe that's the point. Maybe her silence is the answer itself, because some stories are not told to be finished. They are told so we remember not to forget. And somewhere deep below, the Titanic sleeps in darkness, still teaching, still haunting, still reminding us that even in ruin, there is meaning. More than a century has passed since the Titanic slipped beneath the sea. The world has changed, empires have fallen, cities have risen, machines have learned to think. And yet, somewhere beneath 2.5 miles of cold Atlantic water, the ship still sleeps. She lies split in two across the ocean floor, the bow proud, the stern shattered, and between them, a trail of twisted iron and broken dreams. But she is not gone. No, she endures in ways only stories can, because some things do not rust. Not courage, not love, not memory. Every April, people still pause to remember her. In Belfast, where her bones were forged. In Southampton, where her crew kissed their families goodbye. In New York, where the living stepped ashore and never stopped hearing the sea. Candles are lit, names are read, and for a moment, time folds, and it feels as though the ship is rising again through the dark, just long enough for her story to breathe. Historians call her a tragedy. Engineers call her a lesson. Writers call her a myth. But for those who still dream of her, she is something else. A mirror held up to humanity's oldest truth, that we are both creators and destroyers of wonder. In the deep, microbes eat away at her steel, tiny, tireless artisans of decay. One day, they say, the ship will vanish completely, turn to dust and salt, claimed at last by the ocean that gave her meaning. And yet, will she really be gone? Look around. Her story still sails. In the books read by sleepless travelers, in the films that make us cry for people long dead, in the music that still plays her final hymn, Nearer, My God, to Thee, a melody that has never stopped drifting across the years. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it now, soft violins echoing through time, a prayer whispered not for the dying, but for the living who must remember. Because the Titanic was never truly about ice and iron. It was about the fragile beauty of belief, about how humanity, in all its brilliance and blindness, reaches for the heavens even when the sea waits below. And maybe that is what makes her immortal. Not her wreck, not her wealth, but the persistence of her story. A story that humbles the proud, comforts the grieving, and reminds the restless that even in failure, there can be grace. The divers who visit her today say the silence down there feels alive. When their lights pass over her railings, the shadows seem to move, as if the ship is remembering herself. The current sighs through her empty windows, and the silt rises gently, like breath. One day, the Titanic will crumble completely. Her decks will collapse, her walls dissolve. But that will not be her end, because she has already entered eternity. Not in steel, but in story. In every classroom that studies her. In every lullaby that mentions her name. In every quiet listener who drifts to sleep, imagining what it must have felt like to stand beneath those bright stars on that calm April night, believing the world was unbreakable. Would you have seen it coming? Would you have listened to the warnings? Or would you, like them, have trusted the light too much to fear the dark? The sea does not answer. It only reflects. Above the wreck, currents still shift softly through the cold. Sometimes, when the water is clear and still, the moonlight touches the surface just right, and for a fleeting moment, it looks as if something vast is shining beneath it, a shape of silver and memory, rising once more to remind the world that beauty and loss often share the same face. And so the Titanic sails on, not through the waves, but through us, through every act of remembrance, every quiet whisper of her name, every heartbeat that still trembles at the thought of her. The band played on, they say, and perhaps it still does, in every note of compassion, in every story told to keep her light alive. The sea took her body, but the world kept her soul, and that is why she will never truly sink, because the Titanic is no longer a ship. She is a mirror, a hymn, a promise, and as long as we remember her, she will sail forever